Hey everybody, welcome back to the Ready Fire Aim podcast. I am here with Ruth Birman of Dysrupt Digital. Ruth, it's great to see you again. It's been some time.
Yeah, you too. It was wonderful chatting with you, and I'm happy to do it again.
You've got some interesting things going on in your life, some stuff I didn't even know. I want to say congratulations. You had a baby?
Thank you so much. Yeah, she's such a ray of sunshine. It's our first. And it's really exciting.
Are you getting much sleep yet?
I hate to say it, but we actually were so lucky with her and sleep. She has slept like a champ right from the beginning, and so I feel bad saying that because I have friends who weren't so weren't so lucky, but she's been a great little sleeper, so I feel really fortunate. But yeah, really right from the beginning, been lucky.
Wow, yeah, you are super lucky. I mean, we hear all the horror stories of parents that don't sleep for years, right?
It's not always that way. So it's not always that way in case anyone's afraid.
That's funny. Well, I'm again, congratulations. That is super cool. It's
Thank you.
it's one of the great joys and hardest things you'll ever do. So, awesome for you.
Thank you. But it's exciting every day.
Yeah. So what else have you been doing? What's going on with Disrupt Digital? Like how did you get there? How did you go from where you were when you left school and where you are now?
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, that's a really interesting story in itself. But I ended up sort of uh, I was always in love with technology right from the beginning. It was something that I just did as something in my spare time. And my mom was always like, get off the computer kind of thing. And I just kind of put actually that on the back burner for a while. I ended up working mostly in what's now called service design. It wasn't really called that when I was doing it, but I was doing quite a bit of service design and customer care call center processes. And then that kind of parlayed into user experience design. And I'd always enjoyed that. So it was really great to actually start doing that as a real job. I was really fortunate to work on a number of award winning teams. And I started to kind of go back to what front end development really meant and what it looked like in order to do my job better when it came to user experience design. And accessibility. So that was a big focus for me for quite some time. And then I sort of fell in love with the strategic side of product management and spent quite a bit of time immersing myself in different domains and trying to figure out how to solve problems in them. So that was a great deal of fun. And I noticed that, of course, over the past couple of years, uh, ChatGPT dropped, and I think that sent a huge ripple everywhere.
Very
But
much,
then
yeah.
there are more and more tools that were starting to become available on the development side. And I noticed that actually, for whatever reason, it was just moving so fast. It was moving faster than JavaScript. It felt like so.
Can
It was
relate to
interesting,
that.
right? I mean, it was one of those things where it's like, don't worry, it's all going to change tomorrow. But it was really interesting to kind of see that there are a lot of challenges when it comes to what is a really great developer experience. What does it mean to work with really difficult legacy systems, and how can that pain be alleviated? Because there's a lot of real benefits to being able to use these tools when it comes to solving some of those problems that have sort of been a thorn in the side of many companies, and actually has led to some of the failures of some companies. So that's kind of where Disrupt came from. It came from seeing this problem over and over again, having to work through it and innovate through those types of challenges, because there's tons of companies out there. It's not really an if, but when you hit that crossroads, and found that you're already inundated with trying to solve that problem. You're probably pressured to put AI in some way, shape, or form into your product. And then on top of that, you have to modernize your own processes. And so we decided to focus on that developer experience to help folks figure out how to move through those problems a lot better than maybe they were in the past.
It's an interesting kind of phase, I guess you'd say, we're in business right now. And I had this conversation the other day, but it seems like right now with AI, we're trying to fit AI into legacy processes and legacy systems and solve legacy problems, whereas AI is not the business yet, but it's kind of like when we tried to figure out, okay, how do we go from the telephone to the fax machine and from the fax machine to the computer, and how do we kind of shoehorn these solutions into our existing legacy business rather than building the business around the technology first. And I don't know what the answer is. I don't know how we're or if we're going to get there, because now people start companies, and the technology is the business, right? It's not a legacy business anymore. So it's an interesting thought in how businesses can leverage AI and not feel like, okay, like tomorrow they're going to announce this other LLM or this other SaaS product that's 100% AI and we didn't use it and we're already behind. And how do you kind of how do you help businesses navigate that feeling of fear of not only missing out, but like, what if I make a choice and then tomorrow it's different?
Yeah, I mean, well, I feel like, going back to the earlier JavaScript joke, I feel like we've been navigating that in some way, shape, or form, like a little bit, where, you kind of make a bit of a bet and stick with it. But also, what's interesting is that when you think about it, if you pick a framework, maybe that isn't the best fit, but you've got some processes in place, or perhaps you have a really great service-oriented architecture, and you can kind of lift and shift some of those things as you go. It doesn't seem so scary, but within our own internal processes, they aren't quite as easy to lift and shift. They feel a lot more entrenched. And so part of it is looking at, okay, how do we actually make this a little bit easier and more modular so that you can actually switch things out? And where does it make sense? And what tools actually make sense? Because each of these models are also better or worse at certain things. And so, which ones are the right fit? Which tools are the right fit? Does it make sense to be using something that's like, straight from the source, like Claude Code, or does it make sense to use something like Copilot? There are other things to consider too, like context compression that also occurs. A lot of other context is being sent along with whatever it is that you're asking it. And I think really it's looking at what have you got going on in terms of your current processes today. And one of the hardest things to kind of get people to take a step back is to kind of sit back and say, like, okay, wait a minute, why, how did we get here and why are we here? And how we got there is really important because a lot of people forget to ask that question. And there's a lot of really good reasons why stuff was put in place. There was some pain that was experienced at some point, and then something was put in place. So knowing the history of it's really important, but then starting to tease it apart and say, okay, like how can we actually maybe break this apart and figure out where we can replace certain parts of the process with something else, and leave that in a way that's Gartner had called it like a composable process, really thinking about how you can create these modular pieces and move them in and out. That's part of the reason why Claude Code, Open Code, when Google Gemini released their own CLI tool, was so enticing because you didn't really need to change much. You didn't have to change your IDE at all, or a lot of your other processes. There are certain things to look at there, like what can be moved around or taken out or shifted that isn't really so disruptive, but actually has a bit of a lift. And then what are the other things that might be a little bit more painful, like maybe a testing suite or something like this? And then what does that transition look like? And then is the value there to make that shift?
So I would imagine then that you get contacted by decision makers, maybe CEOs, maybe people that want to see a change or want to see AI leveraged in their company, but maybe they don't have full buy-in from the staff, right? They just know we need to use AI. Here's a problem I see. Help. And how do you kind of do you work around that? Do you work with them to make sure you get buy-in, or are you just kind of going with their vision and implementing?
Well, that no, that just never really
Was that a
works.
loaded question?
No, I mean, but how many times do you see somebody try to do that though, and it's like running into a brick wall? And then everybody's mad, and you don't really get anywhere with it. I mean, it is really important to address that. And I'd also say that you can't really BS people either. Like if your real intent is like, how do we replace as many people as possible? I mean, that's going to come through, right? Because there's probably other things that staff have felt. But I would say really what's important is to look at it through an automation lens. I mean, would we not automate testing? It just seems like such a ridiculous notion to be like, no, we are only going to remain with manual testing. I mean, that's really nobody's preference. Would we never remove toil on the DevOps side if we could? Of course not. We would try to do that as much as possible, right? So when I look at where things are going, these are things that are kind of ripe for automation already in some way, shape, or form. But there are other things too. Like, I mean, are you really going to put a bunch of autonomous agents in place and all of a sudden you're going to have, three autonomous agents, which means you have three devs, and that's really also not the case either. And then there are other things to look at too, like security considerations, which is another really big thing to look at too. Sometimes it does some strange things as you're starting to kind of learn how to prompt properly, or what models you're using, or what the limitations of your context window is. There are a lot of pieces there. And I would say really looking at how do you get some of those really difficult tasks sort of moved out of the way. I don't really think I've seen a lot of tech companies that are like, "Hey, we have a shortage of features to implement." You know, I haven't seen it yet, but maybe they're out there. I don't know.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing when you talk about replacing, right? And there was that concern when Henry Ford essentially developed the modern day manufacturing line. And there was concern, for example, and this comes from my own personal life, but there's a concern of legal secretaries when computers really became, widespread in the legal place. And when printers became part of the equation, and all these major developments in technology, people worry about jobs. I think it's natural to feel like part of my job is being replaced by technology. But you bring up a great point that, at least currently, it's not so easy to just say, okay, AI, you're going to do this job. That sounds great. And you see SaaS companies that say, use natural language to implement these agents. It never works out that way. And even when it is that good, it frees people up to do other things. So it doesn't necessarily mean a loss of jobs. It just means a change in skill sets, right?
Yeah, that's often what we see. So like maybe there's more. Honestly, there's a lot more focus on the security side on that piece. There's also some really interesting things in terms of how it's changing UX and products as well, and some mindset shifts that have to happen on both sides. I spent time in both, and so there's maybe a little less resistance on the UX side to be felt when you actually get handed a thing. It's really with the intention of like, hey, this is what's in my head around the domain that we know about, and so how do we sort of take this vision and bring it to life? And, that can actually also help in terms of specifications. How many times can, anybody really get through some dense specifications? It's not really all that easy to do. I remember a time in waterfall where you had the 300-page BRD, the 600-page FRD, and the TRD, all the RDs, right? And so like there are hundreds of pages and nobody ever read them, and they were too dense to really get through and fully understand. And so there's some real benefit, instead of writing all of that, which becomes stale very quickly, to create something really quick, test with it, and then hand that over. It's like a picture's worth 1,000 words type of thing. And so there's a lot of really cool automation that can happen there. On the UX side, there's a lot of really cool automation that can happen on the design system side, where you can actually take a full blown design system and kind of, for lack of a better term, one shot that into something decent in the front end. And so, there's a lot of really great automation there. Does that mean you may have needed as many people doing some of those things? Maybe not, but there are other areas where that's needed. I mean, how often have we really had people super focused on accessibility? It's tough, like that seems to be one thing that always is out the window, or making an experience just a little bit more elegant. I mean, there are times where I've implemented a table where there is definitely better other alternatives, but a table would work as an MVP, right? And so you implement that because it was just faster. There are more elegant experiences that could be had, and it's an opportunity to really start perfecting a product, as opposed to just doing that thin vertical slice every single time, and everybody wondering when we're ever going to revisit that kind of janky implementation of something.
Well, and it leads to, I mean, that's kind of one of the tenets of this show, right? Is that imperfect action is better than no action at all. And iterative change is much more powerful than waiting forever to try and make it perfect, which it will never be.
But imagine how much faster that iteration could actually be.
Absolutely.
Instead of going stealth for 6 months, a year, or whatever time it takes, where you're kind of riding the red line of debt to try to get something out for an early stage organization anyway, imagine that you can actually push something out there that's decently usable, start getting some feedback on whether or not it's even relevant, I mean, hopefully you've actually tested the idea first. Really throwing something out there and then iterating even faster. It just, to me, there's never been a shortage of product or expansion that companies are out there wishing that they had less of. Usually customers are more than happy to throw ideas out there because there's always more that tools could be doing to solve their problems. And so being able to do that, refine it and make it better. I mean, that's it. It's kind of a dream to be able to do that faster.
It really is. And I can speak personally, just in the last 2 days, I've been doing a lot of vibe coding, and the amount of apps I've produced for $40 in vibe coding that are actually viable, that are more than an MVP. I mean, they're actually, I could sell them tomorrow, right? And I create them to solve my own problems, but the idea is they're much more secure than they were even 6 months ago, and I can do it, like you said, much faster. It doesn't have to be perfect. Here's the base function. Now, Ruth, how about you test it for me and tell me what you'd like to see, and I can iterate those changes tomorrow.
Yeah, exactly. And then you have something that resonates even better in the market. But what's interesting too is that for a lot of those platforms, I have heard the same thing, and there have been reports of the same thing where a lot of times people are doing it for their own tooling. But it would be so cool to see people just solve even more challenges with products. It's really neat to see. And to throw it out there, throw it at the wall, see what customers say, and then actually be able to change it real time. It's just incredible.
Yeah, if you're experiencing the problem yourself, it's likely you're not the only one.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
if you can solve that problem for yourself and solve it for one other person, chances are they're going to tell somebody they know. Like minds think alike, that kind of thing. So the iterative change that AI allows, and the speed at which you mentioned earlier, security is getting better. I can recall just a few months ago working in a vibe coding app, and it was putting everything into browser console logging, everything. So your total IP is there, all your backend database connections. I mean, everything it's doing. And it's like I'm constantly in every prompt having to tell it, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this. Now the platform I'm using, everything is back end by default. And so, I mean, it solves that problem. It's already looking at SOC 2 compliance for me, so doing all these things that 2 months ago platforms weren't doing.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's more tools out there too that are doing a great job of it. Like Burp Suite recently put their AI out that can kind of pen test Snap. It's not perfect by any means, but I mean, you can at least sanity check some stuff and catch some low hanging fruit, which is really cool. So there are even more tools out there by great organizations. So there's not only are the models getting better, but there's also the tooling is getting better as well.
You kind of have mentioned it when we were talking off air. You've been in AI for like 10 years, right?
Well, yeah, the first implementation of it was not the most interesting. Well, by people's standards, I mean today now folks might make a bigger deal out of it, but it was really just categorizing expenses. If you're self-employed, it's really annoying to do. And, we built a little tool where what was already in place was a connection to your bank account, so it would stream all that information in, and then we just looked at the data that we received and then tried to categorize them automatically. That was with some, a very primitive version pre Gemini. We were using Google Prediction API, I think it was called back then, and some other tools that were either beta or like not being used now. But it solved a really painful problem and it did a fairly decent job of it. And instead of us trying to train the model all the time, what we did was in the application we allowed people to correct it if it were incorrect, and allowed people to categorize it, and then that would train the model over time. So we kind of created a semi-supervised thing with the users training it as opposed to us, because stuff would come in there like Uber and it wouldn't know that it meant taxi at the time, for example. And so yeah, it was sort of, it was not as flashy as now, but it actually felt a little magical back then because it was like, oh man, now I only have to do 20% of these receipts and expenses as opposed to before, and that was kind of a huge time saving. So it was kind of an exciting project, but it definitely didn't have any of the cachet as implementing AI would now. That's for sure.
Was it algorithmic based? I mean, I feel like AI has been around since like the fees, but not AI as we think of it today, right? I mean, I guess what I'm getting at is what has changed in what we call AI from the back end perspective. It's not, what we're seeing now is not algorithmic, right?
No, but the models have also they've gotten better weights, better, much larger swaths of data that they've been trained on, better compute to be able to do that. I mean, with Google Prediction API, that was sort of like an early version of it, but it was just way more primitive in terms of the amount of data that it was actually trained on. But it's gotten so much better, obviously, now that it can really do some heavy hitting in terms of a rough first draft of something. At least in my experience, or implementing entire features depending on if you set everything up with the right context up front. It's kind of funny because it was a bit of a trope and we had a bit of a laugh about it, but it was kind of true, which is like, you know, somebody was having trouble with one of the models and they're just saying, it doesn't know all our standards or any of this stuff. And it's like, well, you do have to kind of tell it that, like there's no one standard any one organization follows. People have different standards for different reasons across the board. And they're like, oh, so I basically have to make it. I basically have to create a developer. It's like, well, kind of, yeah. Like you have to train it to its standards, make sure documentation's up to date for some of the utilities that you're using. Um, it is kind of like training it. When automating front end, I'll use a design system and style it, but yeah, I'll create those components. And usually I use something like Storybook, but we'll create those components and they'll be there. And it's much easier for it to consume something like that than trying to create it from scratch. But you are kind of teaching it your standards and creating a little developer, whether it's front end, back end, or whatever.
Context you mentioned, it's so critical for AI right now. And the models are trying to expand the capability and the size of context that we can use, but it costs a lot more credits to do that. The bigger the context you give it, the better output you'll get, but it's vastly more expensive.
Yeah, but some models are trying to optimize for that more than others. So, for example, Google Gemini really kind of tried to make that their thing by having just an absolutely massive context window, so you can send it hierarchical prompts. So you can basically set something at basically an org level, a user level, a project level, and then at an individual task level. Sometimes you can have prompts that will instruct other prompts. And so they really know that that's an effective strategy because you can send more context, and they have the window for it, as well as things like RAG or CAG. They actually, I think their pricing, don't quote me because it may have changed, like as
It'll
the
probably change
pricing
by the
seems
time
to.
you finish this sentence.
Yeah, I know, right? But I think that they actually, for cache augmented generation, so basically having some stuff that doesn't change very regularly in terms of context, maybe it's customer documentation or domain documentation of some kind, and you throw it up in there in the KV cache, that they actually optimize their pricing for it. So spend less for doing that particular strategy, and so they give you some benefit, and then also that you don't have to continuously send it over and over again now that it's cache. I believe they've done something like that. I could be wrong, but there are other strategies out there for trying to optimize that, but it's a huge balance. And it depends on whether or not you are looking to put all of that pipeline in place. Some of the tools try to make that easy for you so you don't really think about it. Like Cursor did a really great job, in my opinion, better than VS Code. Please don't. There are probably going to be people who are like,
Don't trash the
"You're
sponsors of
wrong."
the show, Ruth.
I'm so sorry, but I mean, like, but that's all changing too. But in terms of those hierarchical prompting strategies, it was just a little bit easier to do. And so I don't know. I think it'll be interesting to see what happens. I think the one thing that is still a real big downside, obviously, is one thing that all businesses really love, which is predictable costs. And that's not really a thing that seems to be happening. Prices continue to be on the rise because the compute is higher and higher as people are using these tools more and more. Uh, I'm interested in seeing if that pushes people into having their own hardware again, just because it's a little bit more predictable than using models. But then you have a lot of all those self maintenance challenges that people are trying to get away from in the first place. So it'll be interesting to see what happens there.
Yeah, you mentioned, I'm glad you brought that up because you mentioned something on your site about building modular AI workflows that, and I'm quoting your site here, that don't lock you into vendors or wild per token pricing. And that really jumped out at me as like, yeah, that's crazy because a SaaS company will use, Claude Sonnet 4 as their back end, and they'll tell you the price per token or the price per credit that you're paying the SaaS company is X, but they don't tell you how that breaks down, right? So if it's $5 for 20 credits, uh, how much does a message into their SaaS program? How many credits does that cost? Is it a fraction of a credit? Is it a whole credit? They don't break that down, and it seems to vary widely by SaaS companies. And so it's interesting to me that that's kind of one of your selling points. And I'm wondering how you get around that. How do you help clients figure out a consistent cost that they can count on with, I'm sure there's some variation, but not those wild swings.
For clients who where that is of note and they would prefer to have their own hardware, there's also some other reasons for that too. Like, for example, they might have some particular sensitivity in their domain for whatever reason. So, this is something where they maybe don't want to be sending this over to other companies. As trustworthy as they may be, anybody can be breached. So, sometimes people want to take that risk on for themselves. And you can have more predictable pricing if you have things on your own hardware. And also, that you may also want to perhaps fine tune your own models, build out RAG and KEG pipelines for that also. So that's where we help some organizations where that might not be something that they might not want to deal with, and they have the capital expenditure up front to roll some of their own.
So you're helping them build out their own internal LLMs just on their own hardware with their own compute power that don't rely on ChatGPT or Claude or any of the others.
Right, and usually we would use
Wow.
some open source models for that, like Olama models, for instance, or some of the work that's been done on Hugging Face, or if they do need some of their own work, then we would look at that too. There's usually there's some pretty good stuff already out there, and self-hosting is desirable for a number of reasons. If they want their standards in place, we can fine tune some of those models for them. But that's
I've
also
seen some.
another. Oh, sorry. Go ahead. I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, no, go ahead. There's other what?
There's a lot to balance there. So, we talked a little bit about context window, and we talked a little bit about Google Gemini, who's trying to tell, like, hey, we have the biggest context windows, which, have their own use cases. Uh, when you get into that realm, there's a lot to balance between what you're sending in terms of context through the prompts, what you're sending through uh, retrieval augmented generation, what other documentation you've maybe cached that you're sending as well. There's a lot of that to kind of build and manage. And then that sort of determines also, and what is not changing very frequently, that the model kind of has to be aware of, whether that be like domain information or standards like we talked about before. There's a bit of a balance there around, okay, what parts do we actually fine tune and spend the money on the compute to do that, because that's quite expensive to do. But then once you have it, your costs are a little bit more predictable than something that might be a little bit more variable. That said, the maintenance of that is a little bit more intensive.
Yeah. Yeah. And then you're talking about, like you mentioned, having hardware engineers on staff, prompt engineers that are all in tune with what you've got going on internally on your own internal system. Essentially, it's interesting. I talk to people all the time about AI like you do, and there's a few people out there that are looking at ways of building data anonymizers for AI. So essentially, you run your prompts and your queries and your problems to AI through their service, and anonymizes the data and brings it back so that ChatGPT or Claude or any of them never see your own internal IP, if you will, or probably identifying attributes that would give away your IP. I find that as an interesting use case, and I haven't seen it in the wild yet, but I'm interested to hear what you think about that in terms of it being an alternate to building an entire server farm inside your office.
I think it's super important. I think that that's the right solution for certain folks. The the challenge with that is always the human side of it, right? So I would say prompting becomes really important because you might have users anonymized. It would be interesting to see how deep they can get into anonymizing aspects of the prompt itself, because you might be able to deduce who it is based off of what is sent through. And there may not be high desire to do that. So I think the anonymizers are really important. I think how they're implemented will be really critical just because, people love to try to, people love to try to extract that and figure out, who it was. And so I would just say like how they're implemented is really important, but I think it's absolutely the right solution. I think it's something that is important in general in terms of even for everyday use, people's privacy. It's just really critical so that there isn't individual profiling. But that's kind of my own preference as sort of a privacy advocate, I guess. So I think it's an important movement no matter what, but there are potential weak sides to it. It may not be possible to scrub every possible identifier, and that is something where you have to think about prompting strategy and training with your own folks. I mean, it seems not related, but sort of similar to customer service training. If you have really good security, um, really, really good security culture, you have, trained all the way down to customer service agents so that they know what social engineering looks like and how to avoid it. Because gosh, you just want to help somebody so badly. And you may want to get help very badly if you don't have a lot of time to solve a problem, right? And so I think, anyway, they seem like two unrelated concepts, but there are a lot of really interesting pieces there around setting a procedure, sticking to it, and in this particular case, not giving out certain types of critical pieces of information to an LLM, even if their aspects anonymized. So then it may not be traced back to you as an individual that works at a particular organization, but then they wouldn't be able, like if you sent a code snippet, wouldn't be able to look at your namespacing and maybe deduce what your app is from there.
Yeah, it's an interesting question too, in the terms of the large data companies that are already pushing into AI, like Google, like Meta. They already know everything about me, and I don't even use Facebook very much, right? But Google certainly has, I gotta believe, one of the largest data sets of humans on the planet, especially as it pertains to business, right? With their workspace platform, whether or not their terms of service say that they may or may not scan your Google Docs and your Google spreadsheets and all these kinds of things, who are we to know if they do or don't? And they could. And it seems likely that they would, because that is data that can feed their AI far beyond even what like OpenAI can do, because their data set is limited to their partnerships and things. And Google just has it. They can do what they want.
Well, I mean, one would hope that if something were to happen, you might have a legal leg to stand on with something like that, especially if it's in your terms of service. But there are organizations where even that risk is something that's too great for them, and so under those circumstances, or even just if there's a desire for sovereignty, whatever, their personal feelings are towards sending that type of information to another organization. There are many reasons to use open source models that are out there. And perhaps it's just that you don't want to send it all to an organization because they can't really control if they get hacked or not. Like, there are other things that are not, those organizations don't wake up every day and say, oh, we'd love for this to happen and do everything they can to prevent it. But there are certain things that might occur. And, there are organizations where the risks are too high to even risk that. So there are a lot of reasons for local models too. And also, bigger isn't always better in terms of models either. Sometimes you can have really great results from a smaller model that has been fine tuned to your particular domain. So there's some cool things out there.
I kind of, in my vision of where this is going, I see that as a more likely path for business. Now, the general public, not so much, but for business, it feels to me like personalized or business specific agents and business specific LLMs will be much more desirable than general open models like ChatGPT. For that very reason, what you're talking about, security, control, cost, all these kinds of things, and having your own agent that knows everything about your business is far more powerful than an agent that thinks it knows everything about everything.
Absolutely. Absolutely. There are some things to balance with that too, like even with fine tuning and reweighting. Like you wouldn't want catastrophic forgetting. So there's some like possible outcomes where it can lose some of the general capabilities that have been built into some of those larger models that you can get on a lemma, for example, from trying to learn some of those specialized use cases. But but absolutely, yes, there could be some really wonderful use cases, or that could be IP in on itself for particular organizations that they may not want to give up. So there are a lot of really cool and interesting use cases for it. But there are some things to balance. Like you can't just, throw so much at it, because there are times where well, first of all, it's expensive. Computationally, it's expensive. You need a lot of GPUs to do it. There's some maintenance involved. But then you can also have catastrophic forgetting too if you lean on that a little too much. So there's just a number of things to balance there, but absolutely, there are a lot of really great use cases for it.
I saw a gentleman a while ago that was trying to solve that problem with catastrophic forgetting and cost, in particular, those two, where he was using GitHub repositories. And he uses this in a business case where he puts every very specific business function into a GitHub repository. And there's many of them for every business. And then his AI agent is instructed through a short context window that if this is happening, reference this GitHub repository, and here's all the information you need. So it only grabs what it needs at the time. And he even built a visual representation using AI. So you could see in a visual representation like a brain, where it's going, okay, I'm grabbing this repository now, I'm processing it now. Oh, I need this one, and it's grabbing it. And you could see it going to the different repositories. It was very impressive. And really, according to him, cut down on the cost exponentially while exponentially expanding that context.
Oh, that's very cool. Yeah, I'm curious what didn't work for them or for him in terms of retrieval augmented generation or the cache augmented generation that led him down that path. But that sounds super interesting. That's very cool.
It might be worth maybe we could do like a panel podcast where we could talk about this. I'm thinking of a couple of people just through your and I's conversation that I would love to get you together with, because I think you guys could talk on a much deeper level about these issues. And I think he's going to be one of them. So maybe we could do a panel podcast, or maybe I'll just put you guys in touch with each other and you guys can go down that road. There's some people out there doing some incredible stuff that I hadn't even thought of a month ago was even possible.
That is super cool. Yeah, I'd love
Yeah.
to.
What where do you see, I like to ask this question in a very specific way. Do you see, and if you do, how long before AI is designing its own chips at Nvidia, making the manufacturing work to build its own chips, and then running itself and installing all these chips itself? Where do you see AI going? That's kind of the question.
I mean, that would be really cool. I think that there's quite a bit of knowledge work that we've lived with not being automated that could have even been before. That is probably a little bit more low hanging fruit now that we will see automated. So I think that will shift things. It keeps getting compared to the industrial revolution quite a bit. I think it'll probably be that for knowledge work, which is not exactly a new concept. Lots of people have been talking about that, but I think particularly in terms of how roles look today. Like for example, I think that there's quite a bit of a blending of product and UX happening now that probably wouldn't have even been possible, even a few years ago. And so I think that will change things quite a bit, and a little bit more of a security posture that has to be taken by development. Arguably would have been before, but a little bit more of that posture having to be taken now more than ever. And so I think that we'll see some interesting changes, but I think that there will also be some big shifts in terms of things that were automated that never used to be before. And so that will just shift the workforce quite a bit. I think it'll be a lot longer before we see, people building their own chips, because at that point, it's not even
Not
just
people, like AI designing its own chip.
right. But I mean, I think designing, sure. But I think when it comes to the actual building of it, that's as fast as we can get robotics to go too. And so it'll be interesting to see how that also evolves as well. It'll be interesting to see how robotics evolves as well. I mean, with Boston Dynamics and like the kind of dog looking robot that can traverse a number of terrain, you know,
Yeah.
it'll be cool to see. I'm not sure on the robotic side, to be honest, but I think that that knowledge worker side, I think it's happening now. It's just taking some time for it to shift, but I think day to day we're seeing it now.
I think about that question, and I think, like, how long before AI is smart enough to solve the heat problem, right? That is the problem with silicon chips, and Nvidia has the problem, Intel has the problem, AMD, they all have the same problem. It's solving the heat problem. So getting smaller, increasing compute power increases electricity needs and increases heat. And so it seems to me that if AI is going to solve its own problem, that would be pretty high on the list, so that it could make smaller chips, design smaller chips, give itself more power, give itself more capacity, and create more exponential growth in its abilities.
It'll be interesting to see. I'm curious of how much training it actually has on that type of problem versus, all of GitHub, which has been out on the internet for quite some time, where it has a better idea maybe of how to solve coding problems than it might actually when it comes to actual hardware. It'll be interesting to see. I mean, I'm not at Anthropic or OpenAI, so I'm not sure how much they've been trained on those types of issues. But it'll be interesting to see. I hope it gets there. That would be cool. I mean, it would be such a huge leap forward when it comes to compute, and hopefully it'll bring some prices down too.
Yeah, that would be the critical part. I mean, you can't even buy a computer anymore, for even half the cost you could 5 years ago. I mean, CPUs have remained relatively constant, but GPUs have just gone through the roof because of the demand.
Yeah, that was interesting. It kind of started with Bitcoin mining, where we saw the prices kind of jump through the roof because demand was crazy, and it kind of just stayed there, especially as AI took off. I mean, I have some beefy machines here because of what I'm playing with, but they were kind of pricey. They're expensive. I'm not gonna lie.
Yeah, what was a $1,000, $1,500 computer less than 10 years ago starts at 5 grand now. I mean, I have a pretty nice computer sitting on my desk right here. It's just this massive heat box, right? Because the GPU is the size of the whole computer 10 years ago, and it just generates so much heat. But just the GPU costs more than my computer 8 years ago did by itself.
The leaps and bounds though in terms of like the amount of VRAM that you have though it has like they've really beefed that up. So I mean, it is also not the chipset that we've had 10 years ago either, because it's now I guess gone beyond gaming really, which was like the main use case I suppose. But yeah, it'll be interesting to see. I hope there's ways for that to kind of come down in the future. It's interesting to see how Apple has kind of even changed their lineup to be more AI focused as well.
It seems like they're playing catch up, at least to me. What do you think?
I mean, yes and no. They had that unified memory thing. I mean, that was really great for rendering graphics, but it's interesting to see them use that for really beefy models on larger desktop systems. I guess they are. I mean, but then really, are they, in terms of the hardware space, it's really them and Nvidia, really. They're kind of the two folks in the game. I feel like when folks are talking about that, they're playing more catch up when it comes to the actual implementation of AI on their devices. It feels like Google Pixel has kind of really pushed that far. I mean, I have a Google Pixel myself, and like they're just little tiny touches where you're just like, oh, that's nice that they thought of that. It's like, oh man, you thought I wanted adaptive charging because I'm going to sleep for the night. You were right. Like I don't need to blast this thing to 100% in an hour. Please slowly charge it and preserve my battery. Like it's just little things like that that you don't have to think about. And they're doing more of that with the release of the 10. It feels to me like Apple's behind in that way, but they seem to be less behind in terms of just having, although it's expensive, outrageously expensive, they have something that you kind of can just buy out of the gate and start running your own local models on if you wanted to. Uh, and that's kind of cool to see. I don't know. They're behind in some ways, and then in others, they're still out there.
I just feel like they're not making the large splash announcements in terms of AI in particular, like other companies, Microsoft partnering with OpenAI, and, Elon Musk and XAI and Grok and all that kind of stuff. Although as good as he touts Grok, and as much as I hear people say how great it is not the brand that people choose when they talk about AI, like, at all.
Well, I think that they just sort of specialize in different things. Like I've heard people talk about Grok as just being really great at rapidly, like just basically RAG. Like it goes out there and it gets like the most up to date information possible really quickly, and it's just very performant in that sense and can provide you a decent response. That's what I hear people talking about with Grok, but I don't use it very often because for me, that's just not important. And for me, what's more important is a massive context window. So Gemini for those circumstances, or just getting really great, well thought out, sequentially thought out code with something like Claude Code. Like I guess I don't have that need, but there are
Yeah.
people out there who are interested in it and seems to be making some money. So good for them, I guess. Maybe Apple doesn't need to be first. It'll be interesting to see if this is sort of their innovator's dilemma moment where they have failed to heed the call and get left behind, or if they just decided that being first to market isn't important and sit around and try to internally perfect like they've done with other things in the past. It'll be interesting to see where they land because I feel like every company has that point of inflection where they're either going to be replaced or they're going to be, sort of the next wave of technology that's out there. And it'll be interesting to see if they hit that. So I don't know, it'll be interesting.
Yeah, they kind of went from that first to market with the first iPhone to now you mentioned with Android or Google Pixel phones or any of the Android based, but they come out with these nice little nuanced things. Samsung phones come out with interesting little things that it wouldn't have thought of, but when they're there, they're awesome. And then a year later, or sometimes 2 years later, then Apple releases it, and it's like they seem to be okay with that. Like, oh, that was a good idea. People seem to like that. Let's put that in the next iPhone.
Yeah, we'll see. I mean, it's interesting because like thinking back around like the launch of the iPhone, they weren't first with that either. Androids had been out for quite some time. Actually, before Android was a really interesting, like speaking of the innovator's dilemma inflection points, there's sort of like a really interesting situation in Nokia where they actually had sort of the first Android phone and then they just made the wrong bet. They just made a bet to go back to their old OS instead of staying with the Linux kernel OS, and we don't have any of their phones now. Anyway, it'll be interesting to see if Apple, has the same kind of moment where they sit back and perfect it and then launch something else that's cool, even though it wasn't first, or if they've kind of maxed out on their innovation. I don't know. It'll be interesting.
Yeah. Well, I think that one way or the other, AI is not stopping whether Apple's there or not. So the last thought I wanted to ask you about, related to AI in particular, was do you see an AI winter coming where there's like a significant pullback and drawback in innovation speed for any number of reasons? The reason I ask is I just heard some news channel talking about an AI winter, and I thought, I know who I want to ask about this.
That's an interesting question. I really don't know. I don't know if that's really what we're going to see. I think right now my focus has been so much on just implementing like usable workflows that haven't really needed like gigantic amounts of widely like wide human information in the same way, right? Like usually it's okay, how do we solve like, fixing this particularly thorny issue in our legacy code base or something, right? Is OpenAI running into that? I mean, it's possible. It's possible because it'll be interesting to see how like different organizations sort of prevent other organizations from gaining their context and poison the models. Like we've seen some of that, so it'll be interesting to see if that actually causes a bit of a problem. But it's hard to, I think it's hard to say. There's a lot of talk out there. It's kind of for me like a bit of a wait and see to see if that actually creates a bit of a problem, but I really don't know. It'll be interesting to see. Right now there's certainly enough tooling out there that's good enough that it can automate quite a few processes, and that's kind of cool. And I'm more than happy to play around with some of that, and then let the big guys fight it out and see what happens there.
Yeah, the automation is really cool. And I remember seeing some of the first automations in like Go High Level, 5, 6 years ago. And we thought, wow, these are great. I mean, look at all the things you can automate. And this just takes it to another level completely with far less effort, really. When you can speak to AI with some good prompting, but even we're getting closer to that kind of just normal human language to tell it what we want and come up with these automations. It really is exciting to see, and I really would like to see at some point, maybe next time we have you on the show, we could share some of the work you're doing, like specifically like the automations you guys are doing with AI and stuff like that, because I think you're on the right track there, and that is kind of the revolution in AI for businesses that have legacy systems, and how do we take advantage of AI. So what you're doing is really cool stuff.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, it'll be interesting to see. It's fun to do. It's kind of like, to me, everybody's just trying to figure out how do we make it happen. And there's a lot of really cool things that don't have to be manual problems anymore. Like, do we really need people focused on like how we build every single one of these buttons? You know, I feel like there's so much more that like dev talent could be doing than like, dealing with like maintaining a design system. You know what I mean? Not to say that that's not important. It's definitely important, but like, there's a lot more out there. And, but, there's a little bit on the training side that'll be interesting that needs to be sorted out to kind of really path people to those more challenging problems. But yeah, there's so much more to life than that. you know, I would just be happy to see some of that go. It kind of like how testing became automated so long ago. It was kind of nice to see people not have to do that manually all the time. Why would we live through that here too? So yeah, I don't know. I'm kind of excited for that part of it. I think that there's a huge lift, and it's cool.
It really is. And I can't thank you enough for coming on and chatting with me. I feel like we could go on for days talking about this kind of stuff. AI is such a vast topic, but especially as it relates to business, I can see that, you're super passionate about it. And I love having you on the show for that reason.
Wonderful. I'm glad that I could have been of use, and it was wonderful having these conversations with you as well.
Absolutely. Well, Ruth, how can people get a hold of you?
Sure. Well, folks can find me at Dysrupt Digital, Disrupt with a Y, Dysrupt Digital, Dysrupt.digital. If you're curious to hear more about what we're doing, we have a little builder community that we're building out, so you can sign up there and just find out a little bit more about what we're doing in terms of content, or like, sorry, find out a little bit more about what we're doing in terms of some of these automations that people can use in their own businesses as well. We're not looking to gatekeep any of that information. It's just stuff that we know can be genuinely helpful. And that's just all I'm really here to do, is to just try to put stuff out there that is genuinely helpful for folks. So we're looking to put a lot of that out there for the folks that need it. And for anybody who needs additional help, they can reach me at that website.
Awesome. Well, everybody out there, go check out Dysrupt.digital. I love the website. I think it's super helpful and informational. And yeah, reach out to Ruth, ask some questions. Ruth, thanks so much for being here. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
We'll do this again.
Thanks. It was wonderful chatting with you.